tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
The Canadian Taxpayers Federation, which has been doing some tremendous work on this, launched a petition, I think it was just 1 week ago, to call on the government to scrap the CBC subsidy, to defund CBC. And this has now reached 52,000 signatures in just a week. Tremendous work. Franco Terrazzano is the federal director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and joins me now. Franco, this is, I know sometimes getting people to pay attention to taxpayer spending has been challenging. It's why you work around the clock so tirelessly trying to get people to pay attention. But have you ever had something with quite this uptake?
Well, we have had some very big petition numbers, but they accumulate over time, right? Like we did have one petition delivery. It was about 200,000 signatures to scrap the Governor General's perks, like the lifetime annual expense account former Governor Generals get. But what's so different about this petition, 52,000 signatures in a week. So Andrew, to me, that really shows a strong signal that there's many Canadian taxpayers that are deeply, deeply concerned, but with the amount of money that the government is sending to the CBC every year, and also that $600 million media bailout.
Yeah, the media bailout is a big one as well. And we've talked about it at great length at True North, because in a lot of ways it raises questions that a lot of people have as to whether reporters are even fairly covering that, because their livelihoods, their businesses' longevity depends on it. But let me ask you, is this to you an issue of content? Is it an issue of the fact that we're funding reporting and the fact that we're funding CBC? Or is it just about the funding itself rather than the specific content that's being published?
Well, Andrew, I think there's a lot of people who have a lot of different thoughts when it comes to this matter. But from the Taxpayers Federation, it really boils down to this. We believe that all Canadians should be able to keep their own money and decide which media organizations they want to fund with their own money, right? Taxpayers should not be forced to subsidize certain media organizations. So it really comes down to that. Let taxpayers decide which organizations we want to support. But then also, too, on the other hand, Andrew, as you know, it's really not fair for certain news organizations to have to compete with massive government-funded organizations like the CBC, more than $1 billion every single year, or these other news outlets that are getting some of that $600 million media bailout. So for us, it's all about let Canadians decide which organizations we want to fund with our own money.
Yeah, there is a leveling the playing field issue here, because all of a sudden, first off, you have to have government deciding what constitutes a media outlet, what constitutes a journalism outfit that's eligible for funding, which raises significant questions, even if I'm not aware of specific issues where an outlet's applied and has been denied. But moreover, you're right. It means that the ones who may not take that, there are a number of outlets, like Blacklock's Reporter is a great example. They are in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. They're an official media outlet, even if they don't go along with sometimes the mainstream media narrative on things. They've said they don't want government funding. Well, all of a sudden, they're at a competitive disadvantage because they have to deal with things without being able to rely on that subsidy. So it almost incentivizes companies taking it because they don't want to be at a disadvantage to their counterparts and their opponents.
Yeah, and you know, you touched on this at the beginning of the show, but just that I think we all agree that one of the most fundamental pillars of a strong and healthy democracy is an independent press, and independence both in practice but also perception, right? I think there's many journalists out there who are doing a great job, but you can understand if people perceive that they might have some bias when it's the government who is funding their organizations, right? I think that is a very key problem, and we're not the first ones to bring up that objection, right? We've heard it from other journalists in the past, but also too, you talk about how you now have an incentive for organizations to want to collect these tax dollars. Well, what about us struggling taxpayers? The federal government, right? Like, what about us struggling taxpayers? The federal government is already more than $1 trillion in debt. You break that down per person, and that's more than $30,000 that each Canadian man, woman, and child is on the hook for, right? How high of our tax bill does it have to get before we actually have a federal government that finds some savings? And Andrew, that $1.4 billion to the CBC, the $600 million media bailout, those are perfect areas to find some savings.
One point that I've always raised about CBC, and this, again, should extend even if you love CBC. I would love nothing more than for people to say, I love CBC so much, I'm paying for a subscription like I do for the Globe and Mail or the National Post, or donating to True North, or taking out a subscription to the Western Standard, whatever the case is. People who like that, we're not saying abolish the CBC. We're saying don't make it reliant on government money. Let it compete like anything else. And even if we're going to have, as a society, this decision where we believe CBC is important, CBC content's important, why is it not a public good? Why is its content not free for other people to republish? Why is it competing with private companies for the rights to carry the Olympics, for example, something that companies pay a lot of money for? Why are they trying to elbow out private sector media? That kind of defeats the purpose of CBC, which is to fill a void that they say wouldn't exist in a free market.
Andrew, so many good points that I want to dissect there. Let's start with this. Even if we want to call this a public good, even if, right, does it really need $1.4 billion every single year? Really, $1.4 billion every single year? And to your earlier point, you said, hey, we're not looking to abolish the CBC. Just remove the government funding, right? The taxpayers' money that has been forced to go to this organization. Now, we've been doing a lot of digging through the annual reports just to make sure the numbers are correct. And the last figure that I saw was that the CBC was able to raise about $500 million in non-government revenue. So we're not saying abolish the CBC, just defund the subsidies that the government is giving to the CBC. Now, who knows what would end up happening to the non-government revenue? But like I said, the last number that we saw was $500 million, not from the taxpayer.
And I think there's an important point there, because I don't think most Canadians, even many who signed that petition of yours, would object to CBC saying, okay, we're going to get rid of the online news section. We're going to get rid of, Little Mosque on the Prairie, or whatever the 2022 version of is. We're going to get rid of all of that. We're going to broadcast in northern communities. We're going to broadcast in Indigenous languages. We're going to go where there is no private sector alternative. They could probably do that for less than that $500 million you talked about.
Yeah, or certainly less than the $1.4 billion
well, yes,
every single year. Like, I have to keep going to this, right? Because even if you do want to make the argument that the government should be funding, I think, okay, like we can arm wrestle over that for about a week, you and I going back and forth, but $1.4 billion every single year. I think that is quite unacceptable. And it's not just me, it's not just you. I think that's one of the reasons why we saw 52,000 signatures on the petition in a week. That shows me that there's many Canadians who clearly think that this is an issue and clearly think that this is a big issue.
And that petition is at taxpayer.com, correct?
Yep, absolutely. Just head over to taxpayer.com, click on the petitions tab, and you'll find it there.
Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Thanks very much, good sir.
Hey, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.